Second Bard. It was late afternoon when they arrived in the town of Clements, with a chain of mountains for a backdrop. The small town sat alone in the wilderness. The remaining light colored the peaks to the west, and created a brief world of vermilion before the evening could be enveloped by blue. Everyone looks so red. It's incredible, Iriy exclaimed.
Yeah, it's like everything's soaked in blood,
The hoarse voice added. And how did Dee look in the crimson world? The people on the wooden sidewalks, the men driving wagons, the travelers high in the saddle, the crane operators, their miners with their carts of ore, the prostitutes, who might as well have been naked. All of them were drawn at first to his gorgeous visage, but pulled back again with looks of horror on their faces. In fact, a traveler's horse and one of the miners' carts collided, knocking all parties involved to the ground. When they were halfway up Main Street, Iriy turned to a building on their right and said, "If you're looking for the hotel, it's right here." All Dee said was, "I have somewhere to go." "Where?" she asked. But then she caught sight of Miko's face as the boy rode on the horse next to hers. He was utterly crestfallen. Before they'd reached the town, he'd spoken less and less, and since entering, he hadn't said a word. That told Iriy all she needed to know. "You're going to put him in an orphanage?" The hunter nodded slightly. "You know where it's at?" "I saw it on a map once." Iriy was just about to tell him not to, but then she held her tongue. She considered the trio's respective futures. "I suppose it's the only way," Iriy said, returning to the boy's side. That was all she could do for him. Presently, Dee turned right off Main Street. The road of packed earth stretched like a thread to a distant forest. 500 or 600 yards up ahead stood a simple yet elegant building, hardly befitting a mining town. An orphanage. Iriy snuck a look at Miko out of the corner of her eye. His little face was turned toward the ground, and tears welled up in his eyes. In her heart the woman heaved a sigh, and just as she was about to turn her eyes forward again, she heard him say, "I don't want to go there." Iriy shut her eyes. "I want to stay with you, Miss Iriy. I want to travel with you forever and ever." She couldn't hear him. She mustn't. Iriy vehemently reminded herself that it was in the boy's best interest to have a settled existence. 300 yards to go. If he said nothing the rest of the way, it would be done. All she had to do was hold out that long. "Dee," she said when they'd closed within 100 yards, her brow furrowing. Dee had got there first, but he didn't turn. Catching up to him, Iriy looked closely. Then, in spite of herself, she said, "What? It's closed?" In the vermilion light, they could see the building's doors were boarded up, and the curtains were drawn on every window. Naturally, there was no sign of anyone. All they found was an uninhabited ruin. Turning to Miko, Iriy whispered softly, "Lucky for us, eh?"
Not very smart, are you, girlie?
Once again, the destroyer of tranquility started to hiccup.
You mean to tell me you still don't know whether the score would be better off with a peaceful life here, or continuing on the road with us? You might be used to a little life of hardship, but thinking the same holds true for everyone else is about as arrogant as you can get. And besides, there's got to be a pretty good reason for a place this size falling out of use. Give some thought to that before you start talking about it, or anyone being lucky. Idiot. What did you say?
Iriy snarled, the corners of her eyes rising. There's something odd about this building. And saying that, Dee wheeled his steed around. Iriy asked Dee what was wrong, but naturally the young man didn't answer. He turned in silence back to the road that had brought him there. The next place they called on was the sheriff's office, where the route's questions were answered. Until 7 years earlier, the St. Golder orphanage had truly flourished. And then the children and staff had suddenly vanished. One autumn day, what sounded like an enormous key turning in a lock had echoed through town. It wasn't until later that people noticed the disappearances. Though not a single soul could provide an adequate explanation for the pair of bizarre occurrences. The staff of 10 and the 37 children never did return, so the institution was boarded up, and 7 years later it still stood there in the red glow of autumn. If you want to put him in a specialized institution, head on over to Asnow, said the sheriff, who was tottering on the ass end of middle age. Although he kept his eyes averted from Dee's face, his voice was dripping with rapture. If you leave him here in our town, you'd best brace yourselves. Mining towns are rough. There ain't a man jack around here who'll cut you any slack on account of being a kid. To be honest, someone could grab him at any time and make him work in the mines for the rest of his life. And there ain't a thing I could do about it. A hell of a place this is, Iriy said, pinching the bridge of her nose. Her tone wasn't critical. She knew as well as anyone that this was the frontier. But there's not much we can do about that, right? So what'll it be, Dee? Do as you like. Here's where we part company. Hold on, the flustered Iriy said as, out of the corner of her eye, she looked at Miko sitting in a chair in the corner of the room. How can you be so cold? We can't leave the kid here. Look after him, then. Dee replied curtly. How can you do such an inhuman... At that point she remembered that Dee was a Dampier, but regardless, she continued. A thing like leaving him here. He's been with us all the time. Why not consider letting him stay on? I can't say which would be easier, traveling with us or staying here. You come up with the answer. But You have a priest around here. Dee's sudden query had the sheriff bewildered. Nope. I bet he'll be one soon. The teacher. The sheriff nodded. In many cases, teachers doubled as religious figures. Since the two vocations had but a few similarities, such ventures often ended in disaster. Though the fusion of the hand that scrawled equations on the blackboard and the mouth that extolled the existence of the Lord sounded tempting enough to make many give it a shot. Yeah, our teacher, priest, might take the kid. Mr. Laszlo's single, but lucky for you, His sweet old mother lives with him. Having said that, the sheriff stopped as if he just remembered something, turning his eyes toward a memo pinned to the side of his desk. There was a date scribbled on it. That's right. Tomorrow's the wall-raising ceremony for the new school. See, the old one went up in smoke about 6 months back. Mr. Laszlo's always out there. Go have yourselves a look-see. It's on the northern square. His address is... Beyond the window, blue darkness was already lurching closer. The trio went straight to Mr. Laszlo's house. The young teacher had only to answer a pair of questions before the matter of him taking the meeker was decided. Luxurious, but I should be able to give him an ordinary upbringing. Leave him to me. As the teacher showed his pearly teeth, D said nothing, but he extended his right hand. At 12, I have to go to the school for the wall-raising ceremony, and if you like, please join us. Bidding him farewell, the two hunters headed for the door. Iriy turned in the doorway. The boy was in a back room, apparently enjoying a game with Laszlo's mother. His cheerful voice brought a smile to Iriy's lips. Saying nothing to the boy, the two hunters stepped outside, accompanied by Laszlo. "Pardon my asking?" the teacher said to Iriy. "But it's my understanding that the two of you have no connection whatsoever to the boy. Meeker? Is that correct?" Iriy gave a small nod. The teacher continued. "From what I've had the pleasure of seeing, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. I must apologize, but to be perfectly frank, for a while I had my doubts that you weren't in fact his older brother and sister trying to get rid of him. If it's possible, why don't the two of you stay here and live with him?" "Live?" Iriy said the word as if she'd just heard it for the first time. "Yes, if you like, for the rest of your days. If that's not possible, then at least until he's old enough for the two of you to go off without hurting him. What do you think of that? I know you must be traveling for some purpose, but..."
Are you so thick you can't just tell by looking at him?
Excuse me? D squeezed his left hand into a tight fist. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm in a hurry," he said. "Is that so? And how about you?" When the teacher's quiet eyes gazed at her, Iriy grew agitated. "No, there's no particular hurry. I'd like to stay here in town and live with Meeker." Although those words resounded in her heart, Iriy shook her head. "I'm sorry. I've also got important business to attend to." "Is that so?" Laszlo said, a smile rising on his lips nonetheless. "In that case, when your business is done, by all means, come back. Come back? We'll be waiting. No matter what happens, please. Come back to us." Iriy gazed stupidly at the proffered hand. Something made her take hold of it and give it a shake. "D?" The teacher gripped Iriy's hesitant hand between both of his. "We'll be waiting here, however long it takes," he told her. His eyes were focused firmly on Iriya's face. Second part, end.